Do you see that massive vessel lodged right in the middle of our neighborhood pool, with its glossy hull towering above the shallow end? If you're wondering why anybody would even consider placing a 40-foot watercraft in a residential swimming area, you're in for a mind-boggling tale. People often say that fighting a homeowners association is a guaranteed headache. I discovered just how accurate that warning was when my beloved boat vanished thanks to the HOA, and I refused to take it lying down. It all began one morning when I peered outside and realized my pride and joy was missing. At that moment, I knew everything was about to change. I'm Marcus Hayes. I'm 38 years old and work as a landscape architect who consults from home. My story, however, doesn't start with me happily mowing lawns or sketching garden features. It starts with a divorce that shook my confidence to the core. My ex-wife Amanda ended our marriage in a painful, drawn-out legal battle that left me emotionally hollow and financially strapped. For months, I tried to salvage what I could from a once promising life. I lost the house we'd shared, lost close friends who took sides, and endured constant phone calls from her attorney demanding more. In the rubble of my old existence, there was only one thing I managed to keep: a 22-foot fishing boat named Freedom. Amanda hated everything about that boat. Ironically, it was the single material item I refused to surrender because it had been my escape during those final months of marital misery. Freedom wasn't just some vessel bobbing in the water. It was a promise I'd made to myself and a tribute to my father, who taught me that life's toughest storms might bend you, but they shouldn't break you. My dad passed away years ago, leaving behind a collection of fishing lures and an unspoken legacy of perseverance. Remembering how he and I had spent weekends patching up old hulls and waxing decks gave me strength whenever life dealt me another blow. Holding on to Freedom felt like grasping a lifeline. It was the last remnant of a future I once envisioned, the only spark of comfort when everything else was falling apart. 6 months ago, desperate for a fresh start, I moved to a place called Whispering Pines. At first glance, it seemed to be the perfect environment for healing a wounded spirit. Tree-lined streets, well-kept sidewalks, pleasant families walking their pets. The realtor told me the community had an HOA, but assured me it was nothing intrusive, a mild group concerned with routine maintenance, nothing beyond reason. Feeling optimistic, I closed on a modest, single-story home nestled near a serene pond. I thought I could park Freedom in the driveway for occasional weekends out on the lake. Ironically, that assumption was my first mistake. Only 3 days after I moved in, I encountered a woman named Veronica who introduced herself as the HOA president. She was tall, with silver hair impeccably arranged and nails shaped like tiny daggers. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. The moment she greeted me, I sensed an unsettling force radiating from her presence. She gave me a welcome packet, but delivered it like a lecture, a list of rules about garbage bin placement, permissible paint colors, guidelines on the maximum height of grass. The thing is, I believed she was simply an overzealous official. I had no idea she was capable of orchestrating a whirlwind of petty fines and intimidation. Veronica's approach triggered memories of my ex-wife's controlling nature. That same condescending tone, that same unwavering conviction that everyone must fall in line. I remember biting my tongue on that driveway, hands tense at my sides, a flutter of old anxieties coursing through me. I'd come to Whispering Pines for solace. It seemed I might have stepped into another controlling dynamic. My phone occasionally vibrated with more leftover divorce formalities, and I'd grit my teeth, praying not to unravel under more pressure. Yet I remained polite. I'd learned enough from the divorce to pick my battles. The first real conflict came a week later when I towed Freedom to my driveway for a short cleaning and minor maintenance. The HOA regulations allowed a boat to be present for 48 hours before needing to be moved to storage. I started early on a Saturday, convinced I would abide by every rule to avoid confrontations. Late that afternoon, as I polished Freedom's hull, I heard a pointed cough behind me. Turning around, I saw Veronica with her faithful ally Douglas, a grim-faced man who seemed to relish scribbling notes on his clipboard. She pointed her pen at my boat as though it were a heap of trash. "Mr. Hayes, you're aware that we have strict guidelines about watercraft," she said, her voice clipped. I nodded, reminding her that I'd read the bylaws. A 48-hour grace period was permitted for cleaning. She narrowed her eyes. "Well, let's see if it truly fits that window," she retorted before spinning on her heel. I knew in that instant she wasn't going to let this matter go. That evening, while I mulled over the confrontation, a neighbor named Mia stopped by with a plate of chocolate chip cookies. She was in her mid-30s, taught elementary school, and radiated a gentle sincerity that had grown rare in my life. She'd seen Veronica and Douglas scowling near my driveway, so she wanted to offer both cookies and a warning. According to her, several residents had faced escalating fines over trivial matters like mailbox color or planting the wrong type of flower. Her eyes, warm and empathetic, conveyed a genuine desire to help. As we chatted on the porch, she admitted to having her own tense experiences with Veronica. Mia told me that once she'd planted sunflowers in her backyard without the correct pre-approval. The fines had been outrageous. She had considered moving but loved her house too much. She also noted that she'd seen me toiling on my boat and suspected I might soon be on Veronica's bad side. I remember thanking Mia for the heads up. Her voice had a soft reassurance that allowed me to breathe a bit easier. We ended up talking until late in the evening, discussing our experiences with controlling people, the heartbreak of betrayal, and how small acts of kindness could feel like a miracle. Her presence was comforting in a way I hadn't anticipated. After the bitterness of divorce, I had become cautious about trusting anyone. Yet Mia's compassion disarmed me. She mentioned that she'd always had a fascination with landscaping and architecture, some minor background from college, and that if I ever wanted a second opinion on yard designs, she'd be more than happy to help. It was a simple but sweet moment of connection. Over the following weeks, I received a barrage of violation notices from the HOA. My grass was an inch too tall. My trash bin was placed in the wrong orientation. My garden hose, apparently, was unsightly when not coiled a certain way. Each letter carried a monetary penalty, which would double if not paid promptly. At first, I tried to settle them just to maintain peace, but it felt infuriating. I began to think that this was more than a random crackdown. My suspicion grew. Perhaps Veronica singled me out. Each fine chipped away at my dwindling funds, already battered from legal fees associated with the divorce. It got so bad that receiving any envelope with the HOA logo made my hands tremble. Old anxieties about conflict and legal entanglements resurfaced, dredging up that helplessness I had felt facing Amanda's endless demands. One night, I summoned the courage to attend an HOA meeting to dispute the mounting fines. Veronica ran the session like a courtroom, her eyes scanning each attendee, Douglas by her side as a gatekeeper. Whenever I attempted to speak, she'd abruptly cut me off. Eventually, they shut down public commentary, not even feigning a polite hearing. Leaving that meeting, my frustration burned hotter than ever before. I managed to snag a conversation with a sympathetic neighbor who discreetly handed me a folder containing internal emails. Inside, I saw references to me as a problem resident, with suggestions to enforce maximum compliance. In a note apparently penned by Veronica, she'd scrawled, "He's too attached to that boat. He'll break eventually." Realizing that pettiness might be more calculated than I thought, I turned to Mia for some perspective. She explained how the Homeowners Association had pushed out several families who tried to resist or question regulations. Some had given up and sold their properties, others simply caved under stress. Listening to these stories, I sensed a shift in my own mindset. At first, I'd moved here for tranquility, to start over after losing almost everything. Now, I was confronted by a mini-regime that seemed bent on micromanaging everyone's lives. My father's voice echoed in my head, reminding me that battles for dignity are worth fighting. Despite the anxiety that fluttered in my chest, I wasn't prepared to let them destroy my last shred of solace. Those seeds of rebellion were watered by an incident that finally hurled me over the edge. One Wednesday morning, I woke up to discover that freedom, the single possession I cherished, had vanished from my driveway. Panic roared through my veins. I dialed 911, fearing theft. The police calmly informed me that it wasn't stolen, merely towed under official request from the HOA. My shock morphed into fury. How could they claim to be following protocol? The boat had not been on my driveway more than 2 nights. The sense of violation was palpable. When I demanded an explanation from Veronica, she simply smirked, telling me to take it up with the towing company and pay the fees plus the accumulated fines if I wanted it back. Standing in my empty driveway, I felt a wave of dread so intense my legs threatened to give out. That boat symbolized my father's lessons, my personal safe haven, the last piece of me that felt untainted by the ruinous divorce. Now some power-hungry committee had confiscated it like a piece of contraband. My phone rang, a gravelly voice from Bennett Towing informing me I'd better bring $800, 0 cents, in towing and storage fees. They added that I should settle outstanding HOA violations if I intended to see freedom again. I drove down to the impound lot, heart pounding like a war drum. When I laid eyes on freedom, I saw fresh scratches along its side. A trailer wheel was damaged, a few fishing rods were missing. My father's prized lures, small plastic compartments holding memories of simpler times, had disappeared. The man in charge shrugged as if it were nothing. "It's all how we found it," he said, refusing responsibility. Something inside my chest snapped in that moment. A calm but ferocious determination took hold. It reminded me of the day I chose to walk away from Amanda's manipulations, only deeper. This time, I swore no one would rob me of what I held dear. If the HOA wanted a confrontation, they'd get one. When I told Mia about the fiasco, how I discovered damaged property and stolen lures, her gentle eyes flared with indignation. She said it was time we uncovered everything about Veronica's operation. So we started digging. I photographed the scratches, documented statements, compiled any piece of regulation that contradicted the HOA's actions. Mia reached out to a teacher friend who had some background in legal research. I pored over the Homeowners Association's charter and minutes from the last 5 years. Gradually, patterns emerged. Towing fees had skyrocketed ever since Veronica partnered with Bennett Towing. Money seemed to be funneling into questionable administrative costs. Mia and I also learned from a retired lawyer down the street, Mr. Harold, that we might find a glaring legal gap in the rules. Nowhere did it explicitly forbid placing a boat in the community pool. That revelation made us both laugh. The entire notion was absurd, but it fanned the spark of an idea in me. If they were going to yank my boat from my driveway without so much as a courtesy note, maybe I needed to highlight the absurdity of their enforcement by employing an absurdity of my own. The concept of actually lowering a massive vessel into that pristine community pool gave me chills. It sounded wild, borderline insane, yet I also felt a rebellious thrill, imagining the faces of Veronica and her entourage, seeing a boat bobbing right where kids usually splashed around. Mia was hesitant at first, but something about the injustice of my boat's condition and the high-handed approach of the HOA spurred her on. She said I'd need more than just bravado. I'd need a carefully orchestrated plan. We set about recruiting a few neighbors who had also grown tired of Veronica's tyrannical behavior. There was Walter, an older gentleman who had lived in Whispering Pines for decades. He'd witnessed how the HOA used intimidation to keep people quiet. Then we found Simone, a mother of two who had been fined repeatedly for silly infractions. She once got penalized because her kid's soccer net was visible from the curb. Everyone had a story, and each participant had a skill. Walter had some background in structural engineering. He understood weights, angles, and how to handle oversized items in tight spaces. Simone knew a local tow truck operator, Vince, who disliked Bennett Towing after they tried to cheat him on a job. Mia used her organizational flair to create a detailed schedule, ensuring we wouldn't get caught mid-season. If we timed it right, we could move the craft in the early hours, exploit the pool gate that maintenance sometimes left unlocked, and anchor the boat before daybreak. Our plan hinged on the fact that the HOA had never officially listed no large vessels in the pool as an explicit rule. We were certain that Veronica believed no one would be brazen enough to do so. Secretly, we all relished the possibility of broadcasting her hypocrisy. Of course, if we mishandled anything, we'd face lawsuits or worse. So we scouted the area thoroughly, looked at camera angles, security patrol schedules, and the structural integrity of the pool. Walter insisted that the pool was robust enough to support something bigger than my smaller fishing boat. Maybe not a monstrous yacht, but definitely a noticeable craft that would hog the entire swimming area. He estimated that if done precisely, we wouldn't break the tiles or cause major damage, especially if we used protective materials. One starlit night we tested our approach with a little inflatable raft tiptoeing onto the pool deck to confirm the camera's blind spots. Adrenaline raced through my bloodstream. I halfway expected Veronica to appear out of the shadows. We slipped in quietly, waited a few minutes, and realized that their security was far from tight. That small, secret test boosted our confidence. We did run the risk of neighbors spotting us, but ironically, many neighbors were already fed up with the HOA. We had a hunch they'd either remain silent or root for us from their windows. Weeks flew by as we continued refining the big plan. I borrowed an older but larger boat from a colleague who specialized in restoring vintage models. He considered it a comedic act of protest. We hammered out the details, a specialized trailer, hush-hush communication among us, designated roles for each person. Mia decided we needed printed signs to hang on the boat once it was afloat. She suggested lines like, "Nowhere in the bylaws does it say no boats in the pool." Spark. I particularly liked that rebellious spark in her. Each step felt like we were orchestrating an elaborate mission, the tension building as we approached the moment of truth. Then came the chosen day, early Saturday morning, just shy of 4:00 a.m. We assembled at the far edge of the community parking lot. A chill breeze brushed against our faces. Clouds partially masked the moon, shadows stretched in the flickering streetlights. My heart pounded so loudly I worried someone might hear it. Vince arrived with his heavy-duty truck, the borrowed boat strapped to a trailer. Walter double-checked the weight distribution. Simone kept watch on her phone for any alerts or signs of movement from security. Mia gently placed a hand on my arm. Her eyes conveyed solidarity. one look telling me we were in this together no matter what. The drive to the pool felt surreal. The roads and whispering pines were eerily quiet. We inched along, mindful of squeaky brakes and bright headlights. At last, we reached the gate behind the clubhouse, the one we had confirmed would be unlocked for weekly cleaning. We held our breath while Vince maneuvered the trailer, using a special padded mechanism that would reduce noise and prevent scraping. Walter guided him with a flashlight, mouthing instructions. For a tense minute or two, we wondered if the trailer might not clear a narrow corner, but with careful angles, it squeaked by. Adrenaline soared through my veins as I pictured Veronica's face upon discovering a boat not just in the neighborhood, but floating in her precious pool. We unlatched the boat. Walter, with me as assistance, rigged a controlled descent into the water. The subdued splash, combined with the hush of our collective inhalation, felt bizarrely cathartic. The craft bobbed gently, reflecting the dim glow of lampposts. We secured it with ropes, ensuring it wouldn't drift or tilt. Then Mia placed her meticulously printed banner across the side, large black letters proclaiming, "HOA towed mine, so I brought one here." Vince snickered under his breath. Simone covered her mouth, stifling a delighted squeal. I just stood there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. We had done it. The grand stunt was complete. Within half an hour, the sky began transitioning from black to a murky gray. We tidied up any stray evidence of our presence and retreated to vantage points we had selected ahead of time. Walter crouched behind a row of hedges with a camera. Mia and I slipped to the sidewalk across the street, pretending to take an early morning stroll. Vince guided his truck out of sight. Simone grabbed coffee from a convenience store, returning just in time to watch the unfolding drama. We had no idea how the neighborhood would react, or how quickly Veronica would be alerted. As the sun rose, a few joggers appeared. They slowed in utter confusion when they saw this boat dominating the entire community pool. One man exclaimed, "What on earth?" Several folks pulled out their phones, snapping photos or streaming short videos. The hush of dawn was quickly replaced by hushed chuckles and murmurs. At around 7:00 AM, a cluster of early swimmers arrived. Their wide-eyed disbelief quickly turned into excitement. It didn't take long before chatter started circulating on the community's social media page. Then, right around 8:00 AM, the tyrant arrived. Veronica marched toward the pool deck, wearing a crisp blazer despite the weekend, her coiffed silver hair pinned back in a style that screamed authority. She halted the moment she spotted the boat. Her posture stiffened, her face contorted into an incredulous scowl. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded of no one in particular, her voice echoing around the mostly empty space. Douglas rushed in behind her, equally stunned. For a split second, I almost felt sorry for her. Then I remembered how she had given zero consideration for my rightful ownership of freedom, how she had inflicted fines and scorn on residents who had done little more than deviate from arbitrary rules. Veronica whipped out her phone to call the police, ranting about vandalism, trespassing, and property damage. Meanwhile, neighbors gathered around. Some were quietly laughing into their sleeves. Others were openly delighted by this defiance. A few supportive souls even gave me discreet thumbs-ups, though I made sure to keep a low profile, at least for the moment. Predictably, the authorities arrived. 2 patrol cars pulled up, the officers stepping out with weary expressions that seemed to say, "What now?" Veronica began a tirade about how the boat was illegally placed, how the HOA's property was being defaced. One officer approached the water's edge, peering at the boat's banner. He asked calmly, "Which code specifically prohibits a boat from floating here?" Veronica faltered, flipping through the HOA binder. She gritted her teeth, referencing general guidelines and common sense. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, shrugged, and said, "That's a civil matter. There's no direct criminal code about a boat in a private pool, ma'am." He grew red in the face. The reaction of the crowd was immediate. Someone stifled laughter. Others whispered in amazement at the officer's refusal to forcibly remove the boat. Douglas stepped forward, threatening lawsuits, complaining that the structural integrity of the pool might be compromised. At that point, Walter joined in, quietly explaining that the load was within safe parameters and no harm was done to the pool's foundation. His measured tone and background as a retired engineer gave him credibility. A few people clapped. Veronica, now more incensed, demanded the entire thing be towed out immediately, evidently oblivious to how large towing equipment would likely cause more destruction than the boat's gentle buoyancy. Adding to the drama, local reporters who covered community oddities had been tipped off. A small camera crew arrived, capturing the surreal scene: a shiny boat perched in chlorinated water, a furious HOA president shouting instructions, and an amused crowd. Mia made sure to wander in front of the camera at the perfect angle, brandishing a copy of the homeowner regulations, flipping through the pages for the newscaster. It pointed out that nowhere did it explicitly forbid mooring a watercraft in the pool. The reporter's eyes danced with curiosity as she asked Veronica for comment. The older woman nearly sputtered, struggling to articulate an official stance. The footage, as we later learned, went viral on social media. Finally, Veronica stomped her foot and declared that she had the right to pass new emergency restrictions. That's when Simone stepped forward, holding a thick file. She began reading from documents that recounted questionable financial transactions between the HOA board and Bennett Towing. The hush that fell over the gathering was deafening. People inched closer. Simone announced that a staggering amount of money had been flowing to Bennett Towing without transparent bidding, and that some of those funds curiously overlapped with Veronica's personal accounts. She read line items that described inflated towing costs, including payments that matched the days vehicles and boats were forcibly removed from residents. The cameras rolled, capturing every syllable of Simone's exposé. Veronica tried to interrupt. She accused us of fabrications. But the more she sputtered, the more we confronted her with additional evidence gleaned from Harold's thorough archives. The neighbors witnessed the meltdown, their once untouchable HOA president shaking, her voice quavering, as she realized the community had turned against her. Furious that her authority was slipping away, she yelled at Douglas to end this fiasco, but even he looked pale and hesitant. The illusions of her power had shattered in front of everyone. An even bigger blow landed when an outraged resident named Laura, who worked as an accountant, announced that a thorough audit would be launched to examine every penny the HOA had spent under Veronica's reign. Applause erupted from the crowd. Laura's voice trembled with a mixture of exhilaration and righteous anger, describing how she and many others had lived under intimidation too long. Veronica threatened all sorts of legal consequences, but her threats rang hollow, especially with the news cameras capturing her meltdown. She tried to turn on her forced charm, but no one bought it anymore. In the midst of this spectacle, I decided it was time to step forward. Gently, I eased myself through the crowd, approached the pool deck, and revealed my face to the stunned observers. Some recognized me from around the neighborhood. I spoke calmly, explaining that the boat in the pool wasn't just a prank. It was a direct protest against the unscrupulous actions that had tormented law-abiding residents for years. I recounted how Freedom had been towed without notice, how I'd racked up fines for trifling infractions, and how numerous folks had been victimized by the HOA's abuse of authority. My voice shook a little, but anger and resolute determination carried me through. Murmurs of sympathy and applause drifted across the gathering. Veronica tried to hush me. She insisted she was simply enforcing community standards. I refused to let her rewrite the narrative. Not this time. I delivered a final statement for the cameras. If you want to speak of standards, let's talk about decency and fair play. This fiasco is the inevitable result of an HOA leadership that lost sight of integrity. Then I gestured to the boat in the pool. I did this to show you what overreach looks like when people are pushed too far. I had pushed too far. The metamorphosis in the crowd's attitude was remarkable. Suddenly, residents were no longer cowering from the possibility of HOA fines. They were demanding an immediate meeting to vote Veronica out of her position. Some older neighbors recounted how this community was once friendly, how children played together without fear of being fined for minor details. People formed impromptu committees, shouting for a show of hands to oust the entire board. It felt like the entire atmosphere had shifted from trepidation to empowerment. Police, seeing that tensions were high but not violent, mostly stood on the sidelines. One officer even nodded discreetly at me, apparently sympathetic. A reporter continued capturing every development as the crowd spontaneously declared an emergency assembly. They needed more than half the homeowners present to conduct an immediate recall election. Word spread fast through text messages and door-to-door knocks. Within an hour, throngs of residents appeared, eager for a say in their own governance. Veronica tried to block the proceedings, but at that point the legalities of the HOA's own bylaws took center stage. Bylaws that, ironically, facilitated a swift leadership removal under certain conditions. In her arrogance, she'd never imagined someone would use those clauses against her. Neighbors lined up, signing a petition, reaffirming their membership status. The newscaster, awestruck, filmed the entire spectacle, a community banding together to reclaim its voice. In a massive show of unity, the residents voted to strip Veronica of her presidency. They also voted to remove Douglas and suspend pending fines until a complete audit was conducted. Her attempts at regaining control were pitiful. She ranted about how the boat was unacceptable, how the entire community was descending into chaos. But no one listened. People were done with her intimidation tactics. As a final blow, one of the newly formed committees demanded that she produce documents explaining the towing practices. Upon seeing the proof of fraudulent billing, the police stepped in and took statements. Veronica faced potential charges of fraud and misappropriation. While the stunned ex-president was escorted away for questioning, the crowd turned to me and asked if I'd retrieved the boat. I offered a nod, promising not to keep it there forever. After all, it had served its symbolic purpose. We arranged for a more professional extraction, ensuring the pool wasn't damaged in the process. The watchers burst into cheers as the boat was carefully lifted from the water. It felt surreal to see the plan come full circle. I felt exhaustion mixed with a wave of relief that overshadowed my earlier anxieties. Mia gave me a warm smile from the edge of the deck, her eyes reflecting pride and affection. With the old HOA leadership toppled, an interim board formed to straighten out finances, revise regulations, and rewrite certain rules to ensure fair treatment of all residents. Volunteers stepped up to handle landscaping, budget reviews, and social events. Instead of controlling every detail, the new group seemed committed to fostering a sense of togetherness. Even the local news station continued to follow up on the story, broadcasting how a once fearful neighborhood had united to stand against corruption. In the days that followed, I paid for minor repairs to the pool area. Walter and Simone, along with a small team, patched any superficial cracks. We wanted to show the community that we were responsible, not reckless. Meanwhile, an audit revealed that Veronica and Douglas had skimmed thousands of dollars in questionable fees and towing commissions. Legal proceedings began, and I heard through the grapevine that Veronica's lavish home might soon be on the line. Neighbors came together to celebrate the changes at an impromptu potluck, where I had the chance to talk about landscaping ideas, share a few jokes about boat parking, and relish this new environment of camaraderie. I also took that opportunity to show everyone the restored form of freedom. I had spent hours repolishing the hull, touching up the paint, and carefully reattaching the name. Mia joined me for a short ride on the nearby lake, her laughter echoing across the water. We discussed hopes, regrets, and how surprising it was that something as silly as placing a boat in a pool could spark a revolution of sorts. Our hands brushed, igniting a spark that felt simultaneously comforting and electric. She admitted that seeing me challenge the system with boldness and a sense of moral clarity intrigued her. I responded that her unwavering support had given me the courage to stand firm. Over the ensuing weeks, the new interim HOA board laid out a plan to revamp the covenant guidelines. They scrapped petty fines, replaced them with cooperative solutions, and opened communication channels. Residents were asked for input on how the community should manage shared spaces. They even organized a volunteer day to help neighbors with yard work, especially seniors who struggled with strict upkeep rules. A sense of kinship emerged. Families no longer worried about ridiculous penalties for simply living their daily lives. My personal finances improved as well. Without the onslaught of random HOA fines, I could catch up on old divorce bills. The local news portrayed us as a triumphant example of unity. They interviewed me alongside some longtime residents who had witnessed a transformation from oppressive micromanagement to collaborative problem-solving. More impressive was how people who once kept their heads down had found a collective voice. This unstoppable wave of empowerment was enough to ensure that the next official HOA election would be about principles rather than petty control. One night, after a long day of meetings and neighborly interactions, Mia joined me on the porch. We sipped hot tea and watched the moonlight reflecting on the quiet streets. She took my hand, recalling how uncertain I'd been about belonging here. She expressed gratitude for my willingness to stand up for what was right, even when fear had threatened to paralyze me. In that intimate moment, we both recognized that all the turmoil, all the frustration, had opened the door to a bond we never expected. I recognized that life's storms, though brutal, often clear a path for fresh beginnings. A short time later, in an official capacity, the newly structured HOA board decided to reimburse residents who had been improperly fined. People were allowed to review their penalty history and dispute charges they believed were unjust. The atmosphere evolved into a celebration of fairness. Veronica, on the other hand, faced ongoing investigations. It appeared that she'd diverted large sums into personal accounts. Word spread that she might be forced to sell her property to pay restitution. She'd gone from untouchable ruler to a cautionary tale in a matter of days. I found it symbolic that as I was reinstating freedom in my driveway, several neighbors passed by, greeting me with genuine smiles. Gone were the days of side glances or worry about someone snapping a photo to tattle on me for a small infraction. The sense of liberation was invigorating. More neighbors started coming together for casual gatherings. Kids played soccer in the street without fear that they'd be fined for making noise. The community started to resemble a place that lived up to its peaceful name, Whispering Pines. Whenever someone new moved into the neighborhood, They found a friendlier, more transparent environment. The new board set up orientation sessions to explain rules, actual guidelines, not arbitrary edicts, and gave tips on how to maintain properties in a way that balanced aesthetics with personal freedom. They outlined a clear procedure for disputes, so no one would ever face blindsiding tactics again. If there's one thing we learned, it was that people hate feeling helpless under an authority that doesn't serve the collective good. Bit by bit, more pleasant changes rippled across the community. The once forbidden fence colors were quietly embraced if they met basic guidelines. Residents who had unique yard ornaments or unconventional paint schemes were invited to share their ideas openly at monthly gatherings. If the community believed it was respectful, then so be it. We hammered out a system of compromise, the polar opposite of Veronica's iron fist approach. Even the landscaping rules, my personal domain, were revamped to allow for creative, eco-friendly designs. At a modest garden party hosted by a newly elected board member, I stood under strings of fairy lights, sipping a cold drink, feeling an odd swirl of gratitude. Mia slipped her arm through mine, leaning her head on my shoulder. We exchanged a knowing glance. Through all the difficulties, we had stumbled upon each other, forging a sense of closeness in the face of adversity. In the corner, a few neighbors jokingly suggested that the next big community joke would be to float a huge rubber duck in the pool. Laughter spread as someone teased, "Better watch out, or else we'll get overshadowed by the next rebellious boat stunt." Everyone recognized that the boat protest was a product of necessity, a final push after our voices had been stifled one time too many. That single act of defiance had forced the entire neighborhood to examine the problem at its root, a leadership that believed it was untouchable. For the first time, I didn't sense regret about living in an HOA community. The newly minted system might not be perfect, but it was far better than living in silent dread. People still mention the day they woke up to see that boat afloat beneath the morning sun. They call it the turning point for Whispering Pines. It taught them that you can't let an oppressive few dictate the fate of a community. My father would have been proud. Even though he wasn't there to witness it, I felt his presence each time I stood tall and refused to be bullied into submission. In a quiet, thoughtful moment, I retrieved one of his old fishing lures, some that I miraculously recovered from a locked drawer in the towing office after a thorough search. Just holding it reminded me of simpler times, of father-son outings, and of the unbreakable power of principle. Freedom, for me, is no longer just a boat. It's a symbol of standing my ground, of not allowing others to trample on what I hold dear. The old me, the man who once cowered at conflict, wouldn't have dared attempt such an outlandish feat. The new me understands that pushing back against injustice is sometimes the only path to protect what you love, even if it means hoisting a yacht into a swimming pool at dawn. Mia and I eventually started dating. Our bond, forged through comedic tension and collective rebellion, grew into something solid, warmed by trust and empathy. We spent weekends fishing off Freedom's deck, an experience tinged with relief now that I could legally keep it in my driveway. During those twilight hours on the water, we'd exchange stories, plan future vacations, and laugh about the insane stunt that changed not just our personal outlook, but an entire neighborhood's dynamic. In quiet reflection, I'm grateful for the unlikely alliances that formed. People who'd hardly spoken to each other before were now helping one another with yard chores, visiting elderly neighbors to see if they needed assistance, setting up social events without fear of condemnation. The community had turned into a haven that I would have scarcely imagined on the day I discovered my boat missing. We overcame intimidation by uniting under a single purpose: no more bullying, No more exploitation, no more arbitrary punishments. Not everything is perfect, of course. Rare disputes pop up. Someone wants to build a slightly larger shed or paint shutters a bold color. But now there's a system in place that fosters honest communication, a committee that mediates with fairness, and a collective attitude that respects differences. That's worlds away from what we faced when the old regime was in full control. Whenever a reminiscent conversation crops up about how drastically things changed, neighbors can't help but recall that surreal morning when Veronica arrived to find a giant boat bobbing in the pool. Tales of her spluttering rage have become something of a local legend. People say it's the best moment they've ever witnessed in any planned community, the day the underdog used cunning wit to stand up to the bully. And, in a sense, they're right. It was the day retribution merged with humor, forging solidarity among folks who'd grown weary of living in fear. I've been told I should consider writing a guidebook, How to Defeat a Corrupt HOA in One Hilariously Daring Move. The idea always makes me grin. If I did pen such a guide, it would stress that communities only thrive when people unite around basic decency. Fear divides. Genuine cooperation builds. Real power doesn't come from a gavel or a stack of bylaws. It comes from collective voices demanding respect. Now, I like to imagine my father watching from wherever he may be, proud of how I resolved a seemingly impossible situation. Each time the sun sets behind the pines and the water glistens around the reflection of freedom's hull, I sense that I'm standing right where I belong. Another neighbor might pull up a lawn chair, wave a friendly greeting, or drop by to share the latest gossip about how life in Whispering Pines continues to flourish. At last, it feels like a home in the truest sense.